You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and federally certified veteran-owned small business. I'm your host, Robert Bain, along with our producer, Chris Spangle. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact us at chris@leadersandlegends.net. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today is Nick Lloyd. He is Professor of Modern Warfare at King's College London and the author of several books on World War I, one of which we will be discussing today. And if I don't mess up this interview, we will get lucky enough to discuss another book that he has written on the Great War. Today's book is called The Eastern Front, A History of the Great War, 1914-1918. Professor Lloyd, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
That's fine. No, absolutely thrilled to be here. And thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, thank you, because I think I reached out to you via X out of nowhere and said, hey, I'm getting ready to read your book. And then I have picked up your book on the Western Front, which I've not read yet, but it's next on the list. And the reason I read it in this order, the Eastern Front is a newer release, which, as you just told me before we started the podcast, is hitting the bestseller list. So congratulations.
Yeah, we found out yesterday. So obviously we're very thrilled that it's been received so well, actually, on both sides of the Atlantic. But yeah, it's the second book in a trilogy. So a full history of the First World War. And so each volume is intended to be, standalone in a sense. You can read it on its own, but obviously when you take the trilogy together, you cover all of the wars. And so the first volume is the Western Front, which for most British people is really the heart of the war. That's where most of the British Army fights. And obviously for the Americans, that is where they fight. And the second volume, we move out to the east. So we look at the other side of the war with Russia and Austria-Hungary, really where the war began. And so it's a very different book and it's a very different story. And then for the final volume, we're going to look at the other theaters. So the Middle Eastern war against the Ottoman Empire and the colonial war in Africa. And so the three together should provide what I like to think is a full history of the First World War.
Let's talk about the Eastern Front. It has some similarities to perhaps the more famous Eastern Front in World War II, but it also has several significant differences. And let's get into that. But first, I want to ask, most people, especially in the United States, we focus on World War II for reasons that don't need to be explained here. But the shooting, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in June of 1914, who was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, the empire, is probably the greatest or most impactful event, one-day event, in the history of the 20th century. If I were to make that assertion to you as a historian, would you agree or disagree?
I mean, I would probably agree. I think George Kennan called the First World War the great seminal catastrophe. And I think you can definitely trace all of the horrors of the 20th century to that moment. Not to say that the 20th century wouldn't be bad or there wouldn't have been elements of horror and war and this kind of thing, or revolution. But it's that spark, it's that event which blows up the old world, really, and causes this great cataclysm of events which destroys the old world, destroys the old certainties of the 19th century, effectively implodes the European dominance of the world, which it had for hundreds of years. And then it spirals out of control. And obviously then you have the issue in terms of the Russian Revolution, which goes on. You have the destruction of things like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. And so it just really goes on. And of course, it sets the scene for World War II as well. And yeah, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to trace it back to that assassination and look back and think, if the chauffeur and the driver had gone the wrong way, gone the right way, what would the history of the 20th century have been? And you can only look back and think, oh my gosh, it's just such a tragedy, and such horrors could be unleashed. And I think that's why the First World War, particularly the origins of it, have so fascinated historians for decades to try and work out, okay, what was the real cause? Was it alliances? Was it ideologies? Or was it a race for new weapon systems? Was it railway timetables, as A.J.P. Taylor said? Yeah, it is one of those things. I don't dwell too much on the origins in the book or in the trilogy, but I think you can lose yourself very quickly when you look at that. You drive yourself mad, I think.
It's actually, I hate to confess, my favorite aspect of the entire conflict is what you just said, trying to figure out how all these awful things, either through luck, through planning, or through human error, or perhaps intent, all came to be at this short period of time. German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck famously, perhaps apocryphally, said that the next war will happen because of some damn fool thing in the Balkans. How right was he? And why were the Balkans so unsettled and seen as such a powder keg that it caused eventually caused all these countries to go to war and the deaths of millions and millions of people?
Yeah, obviously, that is where you have mixed populations in the Balkans, you have rising powers, you have restive national feeling, you have the decline and the withdrawal of Ottoman power from Europe. You have essentially the First World War is almost a third Balkan War. It begins. You have these Balkan squabbles, which eventually drag in the great powers. And I think there's that feeling in the years before in amongst European statesmen and generals, something was going to go wrong, and there were too many arms, too many unsatisfied people and unsatisfied nationalisms, that something was going to happen. And so, in a sense, it's just a sort of a culmination of a long running and a long series of stories about rising powers, falling powers, or declining powers. And that sense you get in 1914, particularly in the East, I think, where you get the leaders of all the main powers there fear the future, and they fear that without doing something, making a stand, things are going to get much worse, and therefore actually war is preferable at some level, because we're not going to have to make compromises in war. We can deal with domestic opponents. We can overawe everyone and get rid of all of these difficult problems that we're having to deal with in peacetime, about governments and politicians and arms and money and budgets and minority rights, and there's the democracy, particularly in Russia, and so there's a lot of issues which emerge. And I think that's the interesting thing that I found when looking at it, was the kind of mentalities of the main players, and they're all fearful of the future and fearing losing face, fearing that they're going to be disrespected and they're going to lose things that they're desperately trying to hold on to, and therefore war becomes preferable at some level. And of course, what you do see is all of those, I'm thinking Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Germany, they all miscalculate, and they all think they can control war and direct it, and it will be relatively straightforward. And of course, they're totally wrong, because it rapidly gets out of control and they go off over the Niagara Falls, as it were. They just get blown away by the water, and it just takes them down the river, and they cannot get off. They cannot get to shore.
Our president, Abraham Lincoln, famously said of the Civil War, if the tug has to come, let it come now. In other words, there was a sense of, in our history in that time period, there was a sense of inevitability. How much did that feeling, Germany's going to have to fight Russia eventually. Moltke, the famous German general, wanted to invade them, I think, in the 1880s, or wanted war with them earlier, under the doctrine that we're going to have to do it, may as well do it now. How much did inevitability play in the sense of helping leaders make their decisions?
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely that. And Moltke is infamous for this sense that we've got a couple of years before Russian economic power or population or the size of their army or the railway system that they're building is going to mean that it's going to be very difficult to beat Russia. But this is a window of opportunity now. And actually, this is almost like a beneficial crisis. And that, yes, what's happening to Austria is terrible and we don't want that to happen. But actually, if it's going to happen, now is not a bad time to do it because we have a number of military technical advantages over the enemy. And actually, if we're going to do it, we need to do it now. And so certainly with the German war plan, the Schlieffen plan, that's a key factor. And of course, it's the German war plan which really drags this out from being a Balkan confrontation into a kind of European civil war, and then of course it becomes a world war because the British get involved. But yeah, I think with the East, I think there's a sense that the Austrian Konrad von Hotzendorf, who's the Austrian chief of staff, he wanted to go to war against both Italy and Serbia numerous times. He recommended this, and Conrad's a very interesting character in many ways at the heart of the book, and there's a feeling that actually they need to dominate this state and they need to put it back in its box. And if they don't, they're just going to be humiliated over and over again. And this means that the kind of glue that binds the empire together will dissolve. And therefore they need to make a stand, put them down, which will re-energize the empire. But of course, the problem is if you don't do that, if you go to war and actually you can't do what you want, then that frailty within the empire is going to become so much worse. And it's the same in a way for Russia, where the Tsar is feeling that if I don't go to war, I'll be disrespected, I'll be humiliated on the international scene if I don't protect Serbia. And therefore, I have all these domestic concerns and this bubbling sort of socialism and movement for liberalism and things. And therefore, war can protect me from that and push them down. But in fact, when you go to war, that becomes out of control. And so all of these powers, particularly in the East, are consumed by the war. And it's a very strange war in that sense, or it's a very strange part of the First World War, because every major power on the Eastern Front loses.
Yeah, that's a great point. Absolutely. I know you have The Fall of the Dynasties is one of my favorite books, as is, I think it's Gareth Russell's. Is he King, Kaiser, Czar? I think is what he wrote, or he wrote a book like that. When you read about how those empires all collapsed, and the irony of Germany actually winning the biggest victory of the entire war, and then the dynasty falls and they lose everything that they won. But we'll get to that. You mentioned Russia. I wanted to ask another couple of questions about that. We had Helena Rubenhold on about talking about the fall of the attempt to rescue the Romanovs. What was that dynasty going through? You mentioned it a few minutes ago. Why did they need an outside catalyst of victory to help save the Romanov dynasty?
Yeah, I think there's obviously a lot of factors which are going in. Russia is rapidly industrializing, it's rapidly urbanizing in that sense. And so that's always unsettling in the population. You have this growing middle class and a growing demand for liberalization and democracy, in a sense that Russia should be like Europe. It should follow that path. It should become a modern European state. But again, there's the other side to the Tsar or the advisors that he has that's saying Russia is actually not a European state. It's a dangerous place full of wild people, and you need the firm rule, smack of autocracy to control it. Because if you don't, it will get out of hand, it will break up, it will be terrible. And so therefore you must proceed very slowly. And so that's a very difficult balance to strike. Which way do you go? Do you mobilize, to open up? Do you democratize? Do you try and sate the anger or the demands of the people in that sense? Or do you go slower and try and control it and try and find other outlets for it? And the Tsar's never sure which way to go. And so he is being bumbled along by these great factors and these great happenings of his state. And obviously there's always been a revolution in 1905. And so There is that sense of real fragility in Russia at the time. And so I think that's one of the reasons why he certainly feels that he has to take a stand during the July crisis, and he has to make it clear that Russia will not stand by and let Serbia be dismembered and everything. And so there is that sense of we have to get on top of this, and I have to make the Austrians back down. And again, they're all gambling on the other side backing down. And of course, no one does.
I ask this question later, but I want to ask it now as a preview to the war, to what you detail in your book. One of the things that comes through, not only in your book, but other books about the Great War, is the role of technology, the difference in technology between the Great War and, let's say, the Franco-Prussian War or the American Civil War. It's just absolutely immense. How did you handle that in writing the book to try to weave in, this is why the killing, the slaughter is so much worse, such greater numbers than it had ever been before?
Yeah, it's a combination of things. It's a culmination of a kind of revolution in military affairs, as we would put it. Culmination of technological, particularly firepower, and lethality of weapon systems, not just the machine gun, but smokeless powder, modern magazine rifles, mortars, heavy, light, medium artillery, quick-firing artillery, the size of the armies, and the fact that they can stay in the trenches for months on end. They can be fed by tinned food. They can be brought in by railways, supported by efficient logistical systems, or reasonably efficient. Not pretty efficient on the Western Front, not so on the East, but you can have these armies in the field for permanently, basically. So there's a combination of things which bring it about, and bring about the level of slaughter, which is just so enormous. It's the sort of empty battlefield where it's so lethal to be over the trenches, that this is seen in all parts of the First World War, the amount of firepower you need. And so what happens is they initially tend to use mass and shock to try and win ground and to destroy the enemy, and have these great kind of battles of maneuver where they'll surround armies. And it can happen at certain times, certain occasions. You get it, particularly something like Tannenberg in East Prussia in August 1914. But actually, broadly, you do see that sense of it carries on, and the armies aren't really as mobile as they would like to be. And so you just see that gradual increase in firepower, which goes about during the war. But in the East, in a sense, you never get as much as you do in the West. And so there's always scope for maneuver and breakthrough in the East. There's always that space in the East that you don't get in the West. And so the very claustrophobia of the West means that firepower becomes exponentially increased. It does increase in the East, and it has to increase, but it's never as much. And, you do require a slightly different combination. But yeah, it's that combination of all of those things together without the maturation of things like armored vehicles or trucks or air power. These things come about, but they're not enough really to break that stranglehold. And so it's really in the Second World War you get more maneuver in that sense. You can do it. You just can't quite do it on the Eastern Front of the First World War. But obviously it's more mobile than the Western Front.
Let me correct myself. The author of the book, The Race to Save the Romanovs, is Helen Rappaport. So forgive me, I confused two people I follow on X quite a bit. You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Professor Nick Lloyd. He has written a exhaustive, very strong account of the Eastern Front during the Great War. Professor Lloyd, let's talk for just a second, please, about Germany. They seem to be the arbiter. If they go to war, everything changes. If they can restrain the Austrians in the summer of 1914, then things turn out completely different. What was Germany's attitude? I know they had a general attitude of encirclement. They wanted their place in the sun. They thought all the great powers were scheming and ganging up against them. But what were their actions in the beginning of the war, and how did it change the entire course of the war on the Eastern? And we'll worry about the Western Front when you come back on, but on the Eastern Front.
Yeah, they're in a position where they do feel encircled, and their war plan is aware that obviously the French and Russians have allied, and there's that sense of encirclement. And so that's a key factor within German decision making at the time. Also the desire to support Austria and the feeling they need to support Austria. But of course there's sort of wide disdain towards the Austrians. They don't particularly They don't necessarily bring them into their war plans. There are staff discussions before the war, but they're pretty loose. And ultimately, Austria and Germany have two very different strategic ideas about what they want to do in a war. Whereas Austria want to close it down and fight Serbia, and they're happy to fight Serbia and give them a bloody nose. And they want German support, then they don't really want to get engaged with Russia. But of course, Germany are saying, look, don't worry about Serbia. We can deal with Serbia later. Concentrate your forces against Russia. Because if we go to war, we're going to have to throw our forces west. And so Moltke says to Conrad, look, the fate of Europe will be decided on the Seine, not the Bug. It will be decided around Paris and not in the East. But of course, for the Austrians, they don't buy this. And they don't really want to. They want to fight Serbia. They don't want to fight Russia. Germany wants to fight France. It doesn't want to fight Russia. And so none of the sides really, they don't really. And of course, at the point where Russia mobilizes and Austria is desperately scrambling to send troops north because it's going to get overrun if it doesn't. And the Germans are saying, look, don't worry, we'll deal with it. And of course, the 80% of the German army goes west. And then the Austrians are there kind of holding the bag. And so it's not a comedy of errors, but it's because it's so serious, but it's this desperately out of sync planning. And it's also the same sort of a mirror image with the Allies because Russia, it gets involved. It wants to fight Austria. Knows Austria are weak. It has territorial gains that it would like to make against Austria, bring the border up to the Carpathians, the natural border of Russia. And it doesn't really want to fight Germany. It has a respect for the German army. But of course, the French are saying to the Russians, look, you've got to put all the weight of your forces against Germany because you'll never have a better chance of marching to Berlin. And of course, the Russians take French money and they're happy for French support. But ultimately, most of the Russian army goes against Austria. And the Russians have two plans, Plan A and Plan G, Plan Austria and Plan Germany. And Plan Austria is very detailed. Plan G is a couple of foolscap pieces of paper. So they don't really want to do it. And they send the two armies up to East Prussia that one of them gets destroyed at Tannenberg. But then the heart's never really in it. And that's the sort of dichotomy and that strategic incoherence that you find at the start of the Eastern Front, which is absolutely remarkable in many ways.
Actually, another question about Germany, and it obviously plays out in World War II, but those of us who love reading about Bismarckian Germany or the period basically 1862 to 1918, it is remarkable that Germany performed as well as it did, stayed in the war as long as it did, considering they were fighting, as I think Erich Ludendorff said, we cannot fight the entire world. But they are fighting, they have no friends, basically. The one friend they have is Austria, which I don't know if that's a net positive or a net negative. But talk, please, just for a second about the strength of Germany in 1914 and how it was able to just take on all these powers and come close to winning more than once.
Yeah, it is quite incredible. And I think the First World War, Germany really should have won the First World War. There's no real doubt about that. It does win in the East by 1918. It causes Russia to collapse. It overruns Romania. It overruns Serbia. It almost takes Italy out of the war at Caporetto in November of 1917. So in the East and the Balkans, Germany is supreme. It wins. But ultimately, it cannot prevail everywhere, and it cannot prevail in the West. So there is obviously the excellence of the German army and the coherency and cohesion of German society, and which supports that very highly educated society, very knowledgeable, an army that is founded upon tactical excellence and tactical integrity. And I think these things have been often discussed by generations of historians. But I think with the First World War, there's that confusion of strategies within the higher command. They're never entirely sure what to do to close this down. And even though they're able to overrun Serbia, Italy enters the war. And again, even though they're able to overrun Romania, the Allies land at Salonika, and then the Allies send more support to Italy. And even though they're able to knock out Russia, America joins the war. So they can never really close the thing down because there's a complete dysfunction at the higher levels of Germany. Lower down, it's pretty coherent and works well. But the political military interface is completely dysfunctional. The Kaiser is weak. The military command has too much power and they're too limited. So when Germany decides to launch its great offensive in 1918. There's 4 people in the room. There's Ludendorff, Hindenburg, and 2 senior staff officers. That's it. There's no politicians. There's no Kaiser. There's no head of the German government. There's no head of the Foreign Office. And it's only when they're being defeated that Ludendorff says it would be quite good to coordinate this activity with a kind of diplomatic offensive. But of course, it's too late then. And so they're really not able to marry up military aims and objectives with the reality of politics, because Ludendorff and Hindenburg despise politicians. They're civilians. They're weak. And so really it's the high command that is not able to turn out a series of battlefield victories into a strategic victory in the end. But of course they win in the East. There's no doubt about it. They win in the East, they just can't hold on. They can't control it. And that's why the East is so fascinating. But it's because everybody loses, you have this real vacuum which opens up. So in 1918, that Russia goes into its own level of hell and it, civil war and revolution. And then Austria collapses and you have these new nations. It's a vortex of destruction and despair in the East. And that it never ends in the way that it does in the West, whereas the West ends at a clear point. The East just, it's just a ruin. And that's the great tragedy of the war. But you really see that firsthand on the Eastern Front. You see it in the book. Because I take the story all the way through 1918, because I think often there's a tendency on books on the Eastern Front to end it with the revolution in Russia. And Norman Stone really ends his book, The Eastern Front, really at the end of 1916. But I think you have to take it all the way through to 1918 to really get a sense, the true horror, tragedy of that story.
Civilians have been the unintended, and perhaps in some cases, intended victims of war, casualties of war. I've told other historians, people I've interviewed, that if you can read a book on the 30 Years' War without shaking your head like, my God, this is in the flower of Christianity, and it's just so brutal. But the Eastern Front, one of the things you detail in your book, when it comes to civilian casualties and doing what is necessary from a military perspective and civilian, quote unquote, war, laws of warfare be damned, all the combatants displayed perhaps not necessarily a bloodthirsty streak, but certainly a disregard. How did you come to highlight that in your book?
Yeah, I think you do see it with the movements of the armies in 1914. You do see initially quite differently and distinctly in the East. There is an edge to the war in the East, which you don't tend to find in the West. Now, clearly, the German army have some problems in Belgium, and there is obviously examples of abuse of Belgian civilians, the burning of Louvain, there's massacres at Dinant, and there are obviously instances of that. But you do get it, I think, in a much greater degree in the East. Now, clearly, it's not approaching what will later happen in the East in the Second War. But certainly, you take examples of Serbia, Austria going into Serbia in 1914, and the Serbian, often a lot of their army doesn't really have uniforms. And so the Austrians immediately are thinking these are partisans and civilians. So therefore, they're fighting at us. This is against the rules of warfare. And so they start hanging people. And then obviously, because they get outflanked and they're not able to operate, and you get these kind of hit and run attacks, and then they start attacking the civilians. And then, of course, the Russians are coming in. The Russians are immediately, with the Russians going into some of these areas, they immediately start to Russify the population and move out. What would be Ruthenians, they call them essentially Ukrainians. Jews get moved out quite quickly. And so very early on in the East, you see the civilians are in the firing line in a way that they're not necessarily in the West. Because there's more movement in the East as well, populations get moved around and they have to get evacuated. And cases of the Russian army just herding people towards the Austrian lines. Getting rid. There's a tendency to the Russians tend to see Jews as being pro-Austrian or pro-German, and so they look at them with distrust. And then there's obviously Russian-speaking elements that the Austrians overrun that they're not happy with, and so you do get this on the Eastern Front to a greater degree. And of course, it gets worse as the war gets going, and then these new states rise, and so it is a worrying factor in the East that obviously foretells the greater tragedy, the greater horror to come.
You mentioned Tannenberg, the famous double envelopment battle in August of 1914, where the Germans under Hindenburg and Ludendorff completely annihilate. Is it the Russian First Army, the Russian Second Army?
Second Army.
Second Army. Just take it off the map. But we don't want to do too much in counterfactuals here. Or when you come on again, if you come on again, we'll do 2 hours on the First Battle of the Marne. So we want to stay on point. But how much did the German victory at Tannenberg influence the rest of the Russian front during World War One? Because if that battle had gone the other way, Russia's not that far from Berlin and knocking Germany out of the war. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think it is. I think there's obviously a huge risk that the German high command take when they denude East Prussia of troops. There's only a single army there, the 8th, intending to win quickly in the West. It's an incredible gamble. But obviously Tannenberg showcases what happens when you have a defensive force that has higher mobility, that knows what it's doing, it knows what plan it's supposed to enact. The terrain is on its side, it's capable, it's well led, and you have two Russian armies that aren't really speaking to one another, that lose the enemy. And so there's a whole combination of factors which produces this Tannenberg, probably the single most decisive victory of the war, a single battle of the war, other than the Marne. I suppose you could argue with the Marne in the West. But I think what Tannenberg does is it really puts the Russians on the back front, on the Eastern Front, and they never really recover. And there's always that sense that they're afraid of the Germans then. They know what the Germans can do. And of course, it gives the German army a huge aura of victory and a sense that it's invincible and it can do anything. And
You
so
mentioned
Hindenburg and
you mentioned that in
Ludendorff,
your book.
yeah.
Forgive me. You mentioned that in your book when Russia and Austro-Hungarian forces clash and the Russians realize that there are German units involved with the Austro-Hungarian army, how it completely changed. Oh, shoot. Now we're up against the professionals. What are we going to do?
Yeah, they often will just fight the Austrian division. So if they have this thing called Korsitstangen or corset stays, where from late 1915 onwards, German divisions are placed at strategic points within the Austrian line, and the Russians will simply fight the Austrian divisions. One German officer calls the Austrian divisions, or the Austro-Hungarian divisions, are sort of like a mouthful of rotting tea. Like you poke them and it's very painful, and they flinch immediately. And so the Russians really realize at Tannenberg they can't really cope with this. And of course, again, it really emphasizes that they want to fight the Austrians. They don't want to fight the Germans. But the problem is, as hard as they press the Austrians, the Germans can always backfill. And so the ultimate thing is you've got to defeat the Germans before you could defeat the Austrians, but they don't want to do that. And so I think what it does, certainly for Hindenburg and Ludendorff, is it encapsulates, and it seems that this is the battle they wanted to fight, these grand battles of envelopment. And that's how they can do it. They can do that on a larger and larger scale. And so it ultimately says to them that victory is through decisive battlefield engagement. And therefore, all you need to do is do what you did in Russia or in East Prussia in the West. So rather than thinking deeply about, so if you can contrast that with Falkenhayn, who's chief of the general staff after Moltke is sent home in September 1914, Falkenhayn is more of a political soldier, and he recognizes that there has to be some acknowledgement of the political reality of what's going on. And while he wants to win on the battlefield, he's there, that they cannot lose the West. So that whereas Hindenburg and Ludendorff can only dream of recreating Tannenberg because that's what they know and that's what they think. The problem is Tannenberg Mark II on a greater scale can't really be done, or at least it can't really be done in the way that they would imagine.
That's what happened in World War II. The Germans captured all these hundred thousands of men and took whole armies off the map, and it really didn't matter because more came and more, which was part of the aura of Russia in the sense that it has the government's a disaster, the economy's backward, the people, as you said, are, I'll say, savages, certain populations, but the manpower is so limitless, they just can't figure out a way to, I think I read it one time where the Germans were constantly looking for operational solutions to their strategic problems.
Yeah, absolutely. So Hindenburg and Ludendorff would spend hours and hours looking at maps and plotting the movements of divisions and thinking about which bridge they need to cross, which river. And they will not talk deeply about political compromises, whether we really want America to get in the war and what we need to do to Russia. And so that's a common, flaw throughout the war. Then they're not really sure how to do it. And so ultimately, the story is that you can fight very victorious short wars, but if you get into a different kind of war, then a longer term war, one of resources, then it's more difficult. And so these are issues which in the East ultimately, the Germans are able to do enough damage to Russia to cause it to collapse, but they never really foresaw what would happen, the exact how the Russian Revolution happens. They never really foresaw any of this, so it happens. But even so, you get a sense that they're never entirely sure what's going on and what they need to do. And so there's scenes in the book where even after Russia has collapsed, the Bolsheviks are still flooding German lines with propaganda, and they're not accepting that they're defeated, which according to Ludendorff, they should know they're defeated and stop doing annoying things. And so the war changes in that way. And Ludendorff is very limited in that sense. He doesn't really understand what's going on. His answer is always, we'll just defeat them on the battlefield again. And he's not fighting the kind of war that the Allies are fighting by 1980. But yeah, it's a story in leadership, a story of command and strategic kind of myopia.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmond Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. Our guest today is Professor and historian, writer Nick Lloyd. We are discussing his new book, The Eastern Front, which is part of his A History of the Great War, 1914-1918 series. You included in the Eastern Front what I thought was interesting, Italy. So Italy is a lot allied to Austria-Hungary and Germany in the late 19th century. So they create this alliance right in the middle, triple alliance, where they're all supposed to come to each other's aid depending on certain scenarios. But Italy reneges and creates an entire different front, especially for the Austro-Hungarians to fight. Why did you decide to include that front, the Azanzo and eventually Caporetto, in your book on the Eastern Front? And how did that relatively small theater affect what happened elsewhere?
That's a great question. And I think some people have questioned it and say Italy's not part of the Eastern Front. And in some ways that's true. Traditionally, when we think of the Eastern Front, it's the battles between the Germans and the Habsburg Empire and the Russians in Poland and Galicia. Story of Tannenberg and Przemysl and Baltic states and Riga and this kind of thing. And I think it's what I call the Greater Eastern Front. So I think if you are going to understand that war, you have to include firstly the Balkans, the Balkan theatre, but also the Italian theatre, because they are the other wars, the other fronts that surround Austria. Austria is surrounded on multiple sides by opponents. And so what is Austria particularly, which is at really the heart of the book, having to make those difficult strategic decisions about where troops will go, sending them north, sending them south, shuttling them back and forth. And so you also get the full story of Austria's destruction and decline. And so Austria, how it manages to survive is really quite incredible. But of course, it's able to, with German help, overrun Serbia and then overrun Romania, and even the Russians collapse. But you have this Italian theatre, which begins in 1915 and then becomes bigger and more horrible and more demanding as the war goes on. And so you mentioned it's a minor theatre, and that was always my view, that this really didn't fit anywhere. And the Italians have, of course, a reputation of being very poor and everything. But actually, the Italian theatre becomes more important as the war goes on. And I think a number of historians have really re-emphasized now actually how important this theatre is, because it becomes such a drain. The Austrians can't get rid of the Italians. By 1918, the Italians have got 3 million men under arms. That's bigger than the British army on the Western Front. It's a huge army and it's very powerful. And ultimately, they were able to recover from Caporetto and then crush the Austrians at a series of battles along the Piave River. And so I did feel actually the Italian front is the kind of untold story of that war. And only if you look at it in connection with the other fronts will you really understand what happens when it happens and why Austria collapses when it does. And so I think my view would be is there is the Eastern Front, but there is a greater Eastern Front. And if you want to understand the dynamics of both, you've got to see them in that broader sense with the Balkans, but also with Italy, because they're all fighting the same enemy in that sense. It's the Austrian war, which is the central kind of mainspring of that war.
How much we know, and we'll talk about it later, a different podcast, the effect of the United States entering the war upon the Western Front. But what effect, if any, did the United States entry into the war, which they declared war, I think, April 6th, 1917, the U.S. Congress did? How much of an effect did the American entry into the war on the side of the Allies affect the Eastern Front?
Initially, not really. The Austrians are very nervous about this. And of course, they say, don't do unrestricted submarine warfare. But of course, they're rapidly just shut down by the Kaiser and they're not interested in that because, so the Austrians never really, they don't want to fight. They don't declare war. They try and keep out of it. But of course, they can't really. I think what it does is it opens up the possibility of the Allies, I think, with essentially America replacing Russia. It's obviously very important. I think for the Eastern Front, it's not as obviously important, although what it does is obviously it helps the Allies blockade Germany that much tighter and blockade Austria that much tighter, while also raising the possibility, certainly the Americans aren't keen on this, but the Allies raise the possibility of the Americans coming into the Eastern Front or helping ship troops from the east or from Vladivostok across to help resurrect the Eastern Front. And so they do have a lot of these conversations about where the Americans would be best sent. Of course, the Americans aren't particularly keen to do this, but it gives the Allies different options to play with. But it certainly has an effect of straining the alliance or the Central Powers Germany-Austria alliance more than it could have otherwise been, while also bringing out issues of self-determination and new ideologies about democracy and this kind of thing onto the Eastern Front. And so you get things like the Czechs are looking to Wilson for self-determination. The Italians ask for American troops, ask Pershing for 10 divisions, and he says no. The Austrians, they don't want to do it, but ultimately they're talking about bringing the Americans in and self-determination, these kind of things. And so it has an effect, obviously not as direct on the battlefield as you get in the West.
We've all seen the pictures of the kings and the dukes and the whomever, the emperors with all their medals and their swords and the ballets and gold braid. But the Kaiser really didn't try to direct the war effort of Germany in the Western Front. We'll talk about that again another time. But George V didn't try to be a commander-in-chief. Neither did Franz Joseph, the Emperor of Austria-Hungary. But one head of state, one emperor did. And that's Nicholas II of Russia. It's hard to pick out one tragic figure in a conflict where millions and millions of people died. But he has emerged to me as the great tragic figure of the war, especially after what happens in the assassination of him and his family. Why did Nicholas II attempt to be the commander-in-chief, and what kind of job did he do?
Initially, he should have been commander-in-chief when they go to war, but I think there's a sense of he can't leave, it has to be given to a battlefield, and nobody really wants to do it. And of course, they eventually have Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, who takes over. The problem with the Russians, I think that Nikolaevich says to the French premier once, he says, the problem with this country is I issue an order and I never know really what's happened to it, whether it's been enacted or you think you're pulling the strings, but actually it's like a very big oil tanker. It takes ages to move around. You never really know. And they struggle with unclear objectives. And then the front's too big. So actually controlling the fronts and directing resources is time consuming and lengthy and difficult. They don't have the number of railways that they would have in the West. And so moving strategically around is very difficult in the East. And so the tempo is much slower. And the Russian command teams struggle with reacting to German higher mobility, particularly in 1915 when you get the Great Retreat. And so that's where the Tsar comes in. And I think he comes in because he feels he needs to be responsible for the defeats or that things are going wrong. He needs to step in, provide that coherency and that joining up of political and military elements within the state and industrial economic elements. So it can all go to him. But ultimately what it does, it removes him from Petrograd. It places him in Mogilev with his son often, just wandering around, meeting people and smoking and having a chat. And it's quite slow tempo. So he tries his best, but ultimately it's a very difficult situation they have. And he doesn't really know what he's doing. And so I think he tries to give some insights and he tries to provide that coherency, but it's very difficult to do. And obviously by 1916, the wheels are beginning to come off. And by the sort of end of 1916, you have got serious problems. And the Tsar is many ways a good meaning individual, but ultimately is blinded to the effects of things like Rasputin and the kind of corruption at home that he can't. He's not really aware of. And he obviously loses his nerve in 1917. He's simply not really the kind of autocrat that he probably needed at this point. So yeah, he's certainly a tragic figure. I think he tries his best, but of course he's overwhelmed with it, as I think most people would be. The system is just not really fit for purpose. And as I say, by late 1916, where in some ways some things are beginning to come online, you're getting more equipment, more ammunition, more heavier guns. You're starting to bring those through. The morale of the men has been broken in many ways. And of course, as 1970 goes on, it rapidly, falls to pieces.
Because it would be unfair to assert that Russia had no victories on the Eastern Front. They never had a victory that was dispositive, of course, but they did have some very nice tactical victories. And you detail those in your book. The Brusilov, if I'm saying that correct, offensive. They had some opportunities there to perhaps affect the outcome of the war, but it seems like they could never sustain it.
Yeah, they do. They manhandle the Austrians in 1914, a series of heavy attacks, and they overrun places like Lemberg, and they're almost thinking of invading Hungary at some point. They get close to it. They're really able to manhandle the Austrians. But at some point, they run out of steam, either because it's too late in the season, so it becomes winter arrives and slows them down. And by the time they're going to get going again, the Germans have taken over and have recovered the situation. And so whenever they're able to smash the Austrians in 1916, as you said, at the so-called Brusilov offensive, which really extinguishes Austria's last army. Austria loses an army, about 170,000 men within a matter of days, just disappears. But again, they're fighting in the southern sector of the front, specifically targeting Austrian units. But what happens is they eventually run out of steam because they don't have the mobility that they need, and German units begin to come in and slow things down and then begin to counterattack. And so whatever victories they have they're never able to turn that into a sort of long-lasting strategic result. And then, of course, it leaves them vulnerable where the rear then falls to pieces. So they're pretty much able to always best the Austrians when they're ever in attack, but they always struggle with the Germans. They always struggle with it. They're able to make some indents, but broadly, they're outgunned and outpowered.
But it's fair to say at the beginning of the war that Russia actually makes it into German territory?
Yeah, they do get in. They get into German territory and they drive quite deep into Habsburg territory. But of course, by the end of 1914, they'd been kicked out of East Prussia by a series of offensives at the Masurian Lakes. And things have slowed down. Or they get to the Carpathians in 1914-15. And they're going to push on in 1915, but of course the Germans preempt them at Gorlice Tarnów and then push them all the way back. And that great retreat where their army basically collapses in 1915, or parts of it collapse. They're always on the back foot then, and they're never in foreign territory again, really, apart from very minor footholds.
We have just a few minutes left with Professor Nick Lloyd. We're discussing his book, The Eastern Front. I correct my pronunciation, but it's Brest-Litovsk.
Correct.
Am I close?
Yep, that's correct.
With my American accent, God love it. Anyway, that ends the war on the Eastern Front. Germany takes massive amounts of territory needed for a lot of reasons, but partially to offset the blockade. They need to be fed. And yet this huge victory, this treaty, which is in some ways far more punitive than the Treaty of Versailles was against Germany. I've had more than one historian assert that. In the end, this treaty is meaningless. Or is that an oversimplification?
It's not meaningless in a sense. It can't be sustained. So it's a temporary victory. It's a decisive victory in many ways. They get everything they want. They've carved out an entire new empire. And on the face of it, is an absolutely incredible victory. But the problem is, as I've said, they can't really sustain it. And within a couple of months of the signing of the treaty, they're really struggling in the East. They're having to occupy Ukraine to keep that going. They're having to send coal and money that way, and gold to try and maintain it. And they have to keep troops in the East, which are sorely required in the West. But also that there's a new world that's emerging at this point where an ideological battle is opened with the Bolshevism and international communism. And the Germans always underestimate Lenin and the Bolsheviks. They think these people could be pushed around. In some ways they can, but it's the Austrians that are much more nervous about encouraging international communism in any way. And of course, the Germans famously send Lenin through the SEAL train, that kind of very famous story where they send them through Germany and then obviously into Russia. The Austrians are very against this because they say, look, these people are dangerous. You can't control them. You shouldn't encourage this kind of Bolshevism because you're a monarchy. You shouldn't be encouraging the fellow monarch. Be careful. And of course, like most Austrian advice, the Germans just ignore it. But of course, Hindenburg and Ludendorff just think in terms of the battlefield. But of course, whilst they're struggling in the West and they're having to keep troops in the East and they're having their lines flooded with Bolshevik propaganda, Ludendorff is scratching his head and pulling his hair out, thinking, why aren't these people being good defeated power? Why are they doing this? And of course, they don't realize this is a new game. And the Bolsheviks, and Trotsky says this a lot, it's saying, look, you've got the whip hand over us at the moment, but we're gonna push for a revolution in your country.
Which is where Marx thought it was going to happen first.
Yeah. And so they're playing a different game. And for the German officers, they just don't understand this. They find it very difficult these are strange creatures, these Bolsheviks, one officer says. These are not like proper defeated people. These are people who don't really know the word defeat. They don't care. And they're utterly ruthless. And so I think that's a really fascinating kind of coda at the end where they're presented with a different world. And ultimately, because Germany has to withdraw, the whole place becomes prey to the Bolsheviks.
And it's somewhat ironic that the Lebensraum that Hitler was looking for in World War II, Germany had it in World War I as a result of this treaty.
Yeah, and I think there's no doubt that the collapse of Russia in 1917 and the ease with the progress the Germans had made in the East absolutely influences his thinking. That they can be taken, they can be pushed around, and eventually they will collapse. But obviously that was not to be the case.
We've reached the point on the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Professor Lloyd, are you ready?
Ready.
What was your first job?
First job, I worked it's like a store. I worked in a store, a hardware store, moving paint around and things like that.
What was your first concert?
I think it was a festival. It was a big festival. It was a Reading festival in the late 90s with a lot of different bands.
If you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend? You can even make it just a great war book.
Yeah, there's many good. I have recently been recommending the second volume of William Manchester's biography of Winston Churchill, Alone, which covers his period in the wilderness in the mid-1930s leading up to the Second World War. It's an absolutely brilliant book, a wonderful evocation of the man, brilliantly written, very long, but brilliantly written. Actually, one of the few books when I've got to the end of it and I was in tears. It's so good. Manchester is an absolute, was a real special talent. And I think that is an excellent book that anyone can read and thoroughly enjoy. A real work of great wisdom and historical insight.
What did you think of The Pity of War? Isn't that Niall Ferguson's book?
I enjoyed it. Obviously very provocative when it came out. I think it's done very well. And I think it's a really interesting study in trying to challenge myths and trying to challenge a whole range of myths at the same time in a quite complex way while also being readable. Yeah, a really interesting book. I'm not necessarily sure I agree with all elements of it, but I think as a kind of intellectual work, trying to look again at the war, I think it's really good.
But we'll do that next time. If you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
I suppose I should say something about the First World War, but I think it would have to be the Last Supper.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
I have no idea, really. I have absolutely no idea. Presidents and politicians, maybe not. I think there are many people I'd like to have dinner with, but yeah, no, an interesting question, but I have gotten no one's coming to mind.
The most popular answer is Barack Obama. And the most
Donald Trump.
Yeah. Yeah. He's a few times. George W. Bush, the most popular non sort of politician answer is Paul McCartney.
All right.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today has been Professor Nick Lloyd. We did discuss his book, The Eastern Front, part of his history of the Great War. Professor Lloyd, I hate to say this. I don't know. I've had an hour go by more quickly. I had so much more I wanted to ask you, but want to be mindful of your time. Thank you so much for appearing on the podcast. I hope you had fun.
I did. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thanks for having me on. Always glad to talk World War I, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.